who we were, and who we're destined to become are all reflections of the stories we tell, of gods and devils from tales of the heart to those of fear and foreboding. Stories shape us in the world we live in. Myths, folk tales, and even religious parables all define our cultures and beliefs. In each episode of Faith and Fear, we will dip our toes into the comparative narratives spanning the globe, considering the concepts and archetypes common to us all. And lay shalom and prazir, hello and peace. It's a pleasure. Thanks for following me down the rabbit hole once again in my journey to better understand the stories and beliefs that shape us. The distinction between life and lifeless is a human construct. Every atom in this body existed before organic life emerged 4 billion years ago. Remember our childhood as minerals, as lava, as rocks. Rocks contain the potentiality to weave themselves into such stuff as this. We are the rocks dancing. Why do we look down on them with such a condescending air? It is they that are an immortal part of us. John Seed. This week, I get to bring you a very special guest, Laura Giles, the founder of Pan Society, a church of modern animism, to discuss, among other things, what animism is. We also discuss religious trauma syndrome, ancestor veneration, connecting with nature, and finding one's own connection with spirituality. Laura was a great guest, and as often happens with my guests, our conversation goes on for a bit. So this week's episode is a full-figured one, but it's worth sticking around for. So before I give anything more away, I bring you Animism with Laura Giles. Okay, I would like to introduce Laura Giles. Is there a specific way you'd like to be addressed?
Laura Giles is fine.
Okay, so is Laura okay?
Yes.
I like to ask just to make sure. Could you tell us a little about yourself and your background?
Sure. Thanks for having me on the show. And so like you said, my name is Laura Giles, and I was born into an indigenous animist family, meaning a family that has been continuously animist and minimally impacted by colonialism, which I think is kind of unique. And I grew up in the West, and I'm a multicultural person, so lots of different influences. And a lot of it, though, is the same. So if you wouldn't necessarily know me as being anything different in a crowd. The main differences were spiritual. So I was exposed to a lot of different things when I was little, like divination. And I thought everybody did that. So I was reading cards when I was in elementary school, which isn't that much of a big deal right now. But when I was a little kid, nobody did that. That was like freakish. And, so most of my family most of my friends were Christian. And I would go to church with them because they're my friends. So people just didn't really know, it's not something that you go around asking people.
Yeah.
And then because of those,
there's definitely a stigma.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. I think you just think that people are what you are, and you kind of just take it for granted. And because it didn't really stick out, we didn't do anything weird. We didn't have any weird clothes or anything like that. People just thought we were like them. But my upbringing was really different. And I started doing past life regression really young. That was life-changing for me. I was a professional dancer for a while, dance teacher. I've done taken people on pilgrimages for over 20 years. I've been a trauma therapist for over 20 years. I started Pan Society, which is a church of modern animism, 3 years ago. So lots of different things going on in my background.
It definitely sounds very interesting, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on and talk with you about a bunch of different things. I can definitely understand some of the, like I said, a lot of the practices like you were talking about with divination definitely has some stigma to them, just because at least in the West, and most places that have a strong religious, I will say, not so much religious, but Christian or Jewish or Islamic background, definitely kind of steer away from those kind of things because they've been portrayed with a certain light, so I definitely can see how that could come up as a shock to some people, that's one of the things that your family is interested in.
Mm-hmm.
I've talked to you a little bit about what the podcast is about, and I like to discuss things like divination, faith, fear. I just did an episode on fear, the beginning of the month of October. And I like to discuss the archetypes that reoccur all over the world, and just to kind of focus on the similarities more so than the differences, and that hopefully garner a little bit of understanding that, just because we have different beliefs, they're not always as different as we think they are.
Mm-hmm.
There's always underlying concepts that definitely seem to have a through line with most practices all over the globe. So, in your words, I definitely wanted to ask, what is animism to you, and what does it mean to you? How would you define it?
So it's every time somebody asks me that, I have a different answer because it kind of depends on where
Right.
my head is at that moment. Because to me, it's life. It's such a big thing, and it's hard to wrap your head around it with just words. So the official definition, I think, is the belief that everything has a soul. And we know through physics that everything is energy, which I think is a soul.
Right.
And it has consciousness, which I think, in my opinion, physics proves that as well. But at Pan Society, it's everything is alive, sacred, and connected. And the path to access that is sovereignty, connection, and oneness, which we came up with that because of these questions. Like, how do you do that in a nutshell? But really, I mean, it's the sun, it's the sleeping, it's babies, it's worms, it's everything, and how you relate to that, and how it relates to you, and how these things all kind of weave in and out of each other and create life as we all experience it. And I think that's such a beautiful thing, to be alive. Really, it's the experience of being alive.
I've known about the belief in animism for a while now, and I always thought it was a very interesting and powerful idea, concept, belief, however you want to describe it. And I can completely understand how it can be a little difficult to explain to people, your beliefs in general, because people outside of your own experiences, it's kind of hard to explain some things to them, especially when it comes from a different cultural standpoint. We kind of tend to see things from our own experiences, so to try to explain that to somebody else who has completely different background, it can be a little difficult.
Mm-hmm.
I understand that many Judeo-Christian Islamic religions have their roots in animism. I know just from my own studying, my own research, I know I've learned a little bit about animism in Shinto practices of Japan. I know there are definitely some African tribes and belief systems that have animistic beliefs. And what are your thoughts on that?
What are my thoughts on how they
just
relate?
The roots, yeah, how everything seems to have, how most belief systems kind of seem to have a root, at least a cursory background in animism.
Well, scientists or anthropologists think that animism is the oldest religion, the earliest religion, because they look at it as primitive. And it's like they think that early cultures were children and immature and superstitious. And you know how kids play with things and they think, well, when I go to sleep, my dolls wake up and they party without me. There's lots of stories around things like that. And, oh, the tree is going to hurt if I cut it. It's because they have this understanding that things are alive, and they're not really alive in the way that humans are alive, because they have their own essence. But I think that's a common belief to all people. And not because they're primitive and childlike and unsophisticated, but I think if you spend time in nature and you're observing the way that nature works, you see it, you feel it. It's just a part of you because, everything is connected. And if you're connected too, then you know that everything is animate and it has what you do has an impact on them and what they do has an impact on you. It's the web of life again. If you're connected to it, you
Right.
just feel it. So yeah, I do think that people who were close to the earth have that connection. It's stronger. And that as we go throughout cultures, it's just there. It's there in everybody because, people are part of it.
Yeah, I definitely think that it's weird how something like that can be considered childish, but at the same time, like you said, just being in nature or anywhere really, you can kind of feel a presence. There's a different energy depending on where you go. You can be in a forest one place and it have a completely different atmosphere as a forest somewhere else. Even homes, it's funny when you talk about homes that haven't had anybody live in them, and it's almost like without people in them, they die.
Yes.
They just start to fall apart.
Yes.
You would think the opposite would happen because people are in it. They're going to wear out the building, the structure, and stuff faster. But it seems like they fall apart a lot faster if there's no one in the home. Something like that.
Sorry. I think it depends though on the energy of the people in it. Because if you've seen the movie Grey Gardens, I mean, that had people in it, and that was a disaster. And I think if you're sick, if you lack vitality, if you're negative, then it'll have the opposite effect. But generally speaking, I agree with you. Life needs life to flourish. And where it's healthy and strong, it just adds to that energy, and it's so juicy.
And I also think there's a difference between life and consciousness. Something can have life and might not necessarily have consciousness. I mean, we consider plants to be alive. Most scientists consider plants to be alive, even though they might not think they have a consciousness. So I don't see why it would be so far-fetched to understand that everything has a life force about it. It has something about it, even if it's not what we might understand life to be. That doesn't mean it doesn't have a life to it. I mean, and we're constantly understanding things that we didn't understand, a few years ago or a few decades ago. So I think it's an interesting thing to think on, especially if it's something that is not a part of your background. So it's one of those things that can be like really confusing to wrap your mind around if it's not something that you grew up understanding. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of people who aren't familiar with it find it difficult to wrap their mind around. I've dabbled my toes in like different belief systems a little bit over the last several years, so I think it's a little bit easier for me to wrap my mind around things than some people. But somebody who's never heard about the concept can find it very difficult, and I think that's one of those things that is worth exploring and worth trying to get people to at least be a little more familiar with.
Well, I think we don't have the science to prove a whole lot of things, and that's changing every single day, because now they see that the mycelia in the soil speaks to each other, and that a plant will tell other plants the dangers around, and some plants will favorably send nutrients to their own offspring. So I think there is an intelligence there. And there are tribes, lots of tribes, the Hopi and the Dogon in Africa have creation stories about coming from the stars, and you can dismiss that and be like, oh, these people are crazy. But it's not been that long ago that governments around the world have admitted that UFOs are real. And, these people knew about the stars and have a lot of astronomical evidence and stories and knowledge that the West didn't even have until much later. So I don't know that we can be limited by science. I think that there's a lot of truth in creation stories, in mythology, and just native wisdom that we just kind of poo-poo and be like, these people are crazy. They're just primitive, you know?
I definitely agree. I definitely think that scientists, as great as it can be, is very limited, and there's constantly things that we're all always learning about. And I think one of the key things is to never stop learning and to constantly be open to new ideas. And even if it's something that you might think could be far-fetched, you never know, it could have a basis in truth.
Yeah.
So I definitely think it's important to just keep an open mind when it comes to things.
I agree.
So I've read that you have a background in trauma therapy. You also brought that up when you introduced yourself. That was one of the main things that caught my attention when I was learning about your experiences and just your professional background. So I wanted to know what could you tell us about religious trauma syndrome?
That's a great question. So religious trauma syndrome was a phrase that was coined in 2006. It's not in the DSM, but lots of things aren't in the DSM. CPTSD isn't either, but it's basically post-traumatic stress disorder that comes as a result of being in a dogmatic religion. So these are things that are authoritarian, usually hierarchical, usually patriarchal, where it's very strict. You may not be able to associate with people outside of your religion. There's usually lots of threats of going to hell or some sort of punishment if you do the wrong thing. So basically, it's a lot of control, and you don't have it. It's always belonging to somebody who's not you, usually a man, and usually somebody who's, like a priest or something. So when you're in the space of not having any control of your own life and always being judged, it's like death by 1,000 paper cuts. You might not think that there's anything wrong with it because you grew up in it. It might seem like there's a lot of beneficial things to it because there is nurturing and things like that going on. But there's a lot of things that are harmful in our society that people don't necessarily think of as damaging. So helicopter parents are very caring and they want to love their kids. And usually people don't come in saying, oh, I have helicopter parents, help me. Usually they come in saying, there's something wrong with me and I don't know what it is. It's the same with religious trauma syndrome. They may have thought, oh, I had a great childhood. I had all this community. I had all this, this spirituality, this background, and yet I feel so awful. So it can be really damaging, and trying to break from that is like breaking from a cult because it's been your whole life. It's everything you know, all of your friends, all of your family, everything. So to cut yourself off is like to cut yourself adrift, and then what do? Because you don't relate to the mainstream society. So it's a really, really damaging thing to have religious trauma syndrome.
I definitely think that's one of the things that seems to be growing. I don't know if that's the best word to describe it, but that definitely seems to be one of the things that is causing a huge number of people to stir away from the church and religious organizations in general. I've noticed that over the last few decades, a lot of people have started flocking to paganism and other pre-Christian belief systems, especially those relevant to their background. And I feel like a huge part of that is because of religious trauma syndrome and just seeing the negative aspects of what you said could be very controlling environment and a lot of the hypocrisy that just seems to run rampant.
Yeah, I think especially with millennials and younger, when you're associated with a religion who condemns homosexuality and condemns all sorts of things, astrology, and this is in the mainstream now, and you're just like, I can't get with this. It just doesn't make sense to me. And so you in a space of cognitive dissonance where you have to choose. It's like, okay, am I going to be a good person and love everybody and then not talk to these people? Am I going to deny, something that makes my heart sing it's like I can't do it, so I'm gonna have to leave you. I'm sorry. Or in the case of things like with the priest abuse and child molestation and things like that, when that happens and they don't see the priest get condemned, nothing happens to them. Yeah, that creates a whole lot of bitterness, and people do turn their backs on that. I think rightly so, because it's not what it's supposed to be, and they are looking for places of sanctuary and places where they feel like they can belong. And I think what's going on is a lot of politics around racism, and pale people don't want to be associated with colonialism. They don't want to be associated with slavery and racism. And so they're looking for, well, where do I belong? Well, it must be back here with these people before all of this stuff happened. And that's where the pagans are. That's where the animists are.
I definitely find that interesting. Like you said, it seems like there's a huge resistance to talk about history when it comes to certain things. And just talking about religion in general, the idea that you can condemn all of these groups of people for celebrating Halloween, for wearing clothes that are a certain way, but then you don't do anything when a minister or a priest, somebody who's in a position of authority, abuses a child. That kind of just feels like a slap in the face. And it's like, you're going to condemn me if I choose to be with somebody of the same sex, but this person over here that's messing with a child, you're not going to do anything. You're just going to basically send them somewhere else and let them keep on abusing other children. That kind of thing just, it kind of drives me insane, honestly. And I know that's kind of a grandiose example, but it can go down to something as simple as witnessing. From me, in my own personal experience, I know there were instances of infidelity. You would see married people messing with other married people or having children by somebody who's not their spouse. And then at the same time, a part of the same congregation, they're going to condemn somebody else for doing, I don't know, the simplest of things. And that was one of the things that started steering me away from organized religion. Just seeing the hypocrisy in church was one of the things that kind of steered me away from it. And I have talked to other people, and I know they've had similar experiences. Some have even experienced abuse, not necessarily in the same way as I was describing before, but just, it's one of those things that people who are still involved in the church don't want to deal with, and yet they refuse to understand why people are moving away from it. And I've also seen that there seems to be a rise in atheism, and I think that that's another huge part of it, is people see the dangers of organized religion. I mean, most of the wars have, in the history of humanity, have been because of religion, have been because of power, but power that was often pushed by religion. Or, God says that I have the right to this land. That's a perfect example. Things like manifest destiny. And I think, I'm not hating on religion, but I think that we also have to be cautious of how we approach it, how we deal with it, if that makes sense. I think blind faith can be a very dangerous thing. I don't see anything wrong with asking questions or asking for clarity. And I also think that it's important that we have to be honest with ourselves, and you have to be honest with the people around you. And when there is hypocrisy, I think we have to deal with it head on.
Totally agree. I think we always need to be curious and be a student of history and ask tough questions. And I also think, so with Pan Society and animism, we always have the balance of the yin and the yang, the me and the we, which kind of keeps it in check. And if you have these rules that apply to some people and not all people, then of course you're going to get some discontent there. But if you have to police yourself, and if you're accountable to your community, to your family, I think that creates a lot of responsibility that hopefully keeps people honest. So I really like animism because we don't have those rules. We do allow for evolution, um, and it's not all about power, really. It's about using your power responsibly and using your power for yourself and the good of other people. So it's really, really balanced.
All right. So I guess I definitely want to ask, what do you think, what would you say to those who perceive animism as unscientific superstition? I know we touched on that a little bit, but I wanted to know like what your response to that perspective is.
Well, so my first impulse with that is that, I don't really think anything about it. People can think whatever they want. That's
Right.
another feature of animism, is just to kind of accept people where they are. And if somebody comes at me like that, that's kind of indicating I don't really I want to have a conversation with you about it. I've already made my mind up. So that's probably not somebody that I'm going to engage with. I'll just kind of acknowledge it and be like, okay. Now, if they are interested in talking about that, then we can talk about it. I think that I have total respect for science. I mean, I don't think you should deny things like the Earth is round.
I don't think the two.
I mean,
I don't
there's
think the two are
definitely a place
mutually
for that.
exclusive. I definitely think you can believe in science and religion. I don't think that it has to be an either or.
Yes, and I think that the for me, the intelligent thing to do is to believe in both, because you have science is data. It's provable. It's evidence. And then there's things in life for which you have no evidence. If your grandmother visits you in your dreams, who's to say that that's real? There's no evidence for that. You can't prove that, and yet you have a feeling about it. Maybe she gave you a message that was really, really meaningful, and you can't prove it. Doesn't mean it didn't happen or that it didn't mean something. And I think that there's a lot of things in history that are superstitious, that are old wives' tales, that are creation stories and all of this stuff we can't prove. And yet, later on, maybe they are provable, or maybe they're never provable, but they still mean something to you. So I don't really, the superstition thing, I don't really have a problem with that. People can think what they want. They can say that it's ignorant. I don't really care. But another thing about it is it's fun. It's fun to believe in goblins and things like that. And right. And it's fun to have that possibility. And I think it also opens the door to discovery, because like Einstein, people thought he was ridiculous. He's like, oh, there's molecules. And people are like, oh, no, there's not really molecules. Well, now everybody knows that there really are molecules. So, if you don't have this imagination, if you're not willing to entertain the what if, maybe there's a goblin under my bed, then you're never going to discover these things. And a lot of spirituality is about having these experiences that are unexplained. If your mind's not open to that, you're never going to have them.
I think it's funny that you brought up Einstein and him having an imagination, because just looking around at all of the technology and stuff we had that started off as a harebrained idea, the Wright brothers and airplanes being a perfect example. When they decided they were going to make an airplane, people thought that they were just insane. Before that, just the idea of humans being able to fly in the air from one place to another, nobody could have imagined it. And now it's just commonplace. Most people don't even think about getting on a plane. So I definitely think there is something to say about having an imagination and not being so rigid when it comes to taking a leap of faith in things, thinking outside of the box. I definitely think that has its place.
Well, and also I think in a lot of animist cultures, when you have a dream, like Black Elk, Black Elk speaks. It's a lot about his, I don't even know what to call them. I don't know if they were dreams or visions. I guess they were visions. That stuff comes from the imaginal realm. And you can call that superstitious, you can call it nonsense, but all prophecies come from there. And, if you just dismiss that stuff, I think you miss out on the richness of life, because everything isn't about what you can see, hear, taste, touch, and smell. we are spiritual beings, and we do have a spiritual energy about us and the spiritual realms. And if you never connect with that, if you never reach out to it and don't contact it, I think you're not really living fully.
Right. You brought up earlier about seeing your grandmother or something, having a vision or dream or something of that nature. And I thought that was really interesting because the idea of being contacted by your ancestors or being able to communicate with your ancestors has always been an interesting concept to me. Can you tell us a little about ancestor veneration?
Sure, it's a great question. First, I think a lot of people think of it as ancestor worship. I'm not sure where that term came from or how it became. It's probably like a translation error from an anthropologist. It's not ancestor worship, so they're not
Right.
gods.
Right.
They're just, our dead relatives. And the practice of that can happen in lots of different ways, just through prayer or speaking to them and calling to them in ceremonies of special occasions, honoring them day to day. And it's a way to pay respects to where you came from. It's a way of anchoring you into this life, into your generations, your heritage. It's a way of tapping into a resource for when you need help, because it's a reciprocal relationship. You help them, they help you. It's a way to observe the circle of life, because they are they're behind you, the descendants are in front of you, and then that wheel just keeps on turning. So for me, it's like I said, a way of staying grounded, of knowing who you are, and of tending that so that the next generations know who they are. And I think that's a big reason for how the African American community and the Native American communities are the way they are now, is that those roots were kind of torn away. Because when colonization made it illegal for them to speak their own language, for them to worship the way that they want to worship, and they basically stripped them from their culture and their identities and made them rootless. And so now there is a huge push in a lot of communities to reconnect to those roots. And I think it's so powerful. I think it's so healing. And I think it's going to be good for all cultures on the planet, because, what you do to one person, you do to yourself. There's no way to harm one people and not have it ripple out. So I'm really happy about that. And I just celebrate that totally.
I love that you bring that up, because I know for myself, over the last several years, I've grown increasingly interested in learning about traditional African spirituality in hopes of better connecting with my own background. And like you said, it's hard for a lot of Black people who grew up in America and who, like you said, were disconnected from their background, from their roots. It's hard for them to really learn about the beliefs that they came from, basically. If your parents are Irish, you can basically learn about, Irish cultures and Irish beliefs. But if, you're African American or whatever, all you know is that your ancestors came from Africa. And Africa is a continent. Despite what a lot of people seem to know, Africa is a continent. It's not a country. There are numerous countries in Africa with numerous tribes and numerous beliefs, similarly to indigenous Americans. It's not just one lump pantheon or belief system. There are numerous. They might have similarities, but they are very different. The Yoruba and the Dugon have different religious structures. They have different deities that they pray to. They're not the same. So to try to understand where you come from, there definitely is a disconnect. And I think as I've gotten older, I've felt that disconnect much more than when I was younger. So learning about these things and having these discussions with people like you, I think kind of helps me to get a little closer. And just learning about the different beliefs of people all over the world, I think helps me fulfill a part of myself that I kind of feel like isn't there, if that makes sense. And the idea of being able to connect with your ancestors, even if you don't have a physical connection with them, just feels like a really powerful thing to be able to do. So that was one of the reasons why I wanted to ask you about ancestor veneration. I know a lot of African tribes do have different forms of ancestor veneration. There's a huge respect for your ancestors and the people that have passed on, and being able to communicate with them in very much a way of like communicating with a family member who's still alive and reaching out to them for guidance or instruction. So I'm curious, from your standpoint, what is a good way for anybody who's interested to connect with their roots or connect with their ancestors if they really don't have any idea of how to start?
Okay. I would start with the DNA test, and that's going to be your left brain data a piece, because a lot of oral tradition is just wrong. People just say, "Oh, I have a friend who she was told that she was Persian, and she got a DNA test, and it was totally British Isles." And I have another friend who her family history was that they're Native American, and there's not a drop. Which is not to say that it's not true, because a lot of Native American DNA doesn't show up on DNA tests. But I would start there so that you have some left brain things and some things that you can do some research, some hardcore stuff. And then I would go to that imaginal realm. So this is why you don't discount that old superstition stuff, because you're going to get a lot of information there that you can't get from records because they don't exist. So you can do that through meditation if it's just a sitting practice. I don't know, however you do that, and allow that to be your space to connect with them. There's lots of rituals that you can do. They don't have to be the rituals that your people did. I mean, I think it's awesome if you can get that information, because that continuity, it's in your blood. And when you're around that kind of thing, it's like there's this sense of knowing, when you hear that drum beat, or you hear that whatever it is, or you smell that smell, you're just like, oh yeah, I know that thing. And it just really helps to get you in that space. But really, I think it is a spiritual experience. You're not going to get there through a test. You have to have an experience and be open to them talking to you, and be open to them leading you. If you ask for that help, I'm sure that it will come. And you're going to get all kinds of symbols. So to me, spirit speaks in symbols. I don't know these people who like to get full sentences and, go to the light, turn left. Mine don't talk like that. They talk in symbols. So again, that's that right brain, imaginal, symbolic language, that universal language, and you have to be patient to learn it. So when you're talking to the trees, they don't talk in English, at least not to me. They have their own energy and their own essence, and you have to be patient to learn it. Same with the ancestors. So I get visions all the time of things that I can't validate through my DNA, because, who knows? This is thousands of years of people. And the people that you would think would be closest to me and that speak loudest to me, because I am indigenous, they're not really the ones that I have the strongest connection with when I'm speaking to them. So like you said, keep an open mind. I mean, it could be a totally different culture that you don't even know is a part of you. I've seen things in journeying that I'm just like scratching my head. I'm like, who is this person? Where do you belong? And then, after some discovery, I'm looking at, what are they wearing? What are they eating? What's the environment like? I'm like, okay, I think it belongs to this. And you can look it up, and then, whoop, there it is. So it's really so inspiring when you can validate it with data. But even if you can't, there's something in your soul that just knows when you connect, because there's a love, and they love you, and they want to share with you, and they want to connect with you. And when you connect like that, you'll feel it, and you'll know that it's valid in a way that nothing else can tell you. It's just a feeling.
I definitely find it interesting that you mentioned the scientific and less than scientific method to go about doing that. And just like we discussed earlier, it's important to kind of have a balance between the two. I've actually debated on whether I wanted to do the DNA test for a while now, and I think part of it is I have to find one that's really going to touch on more than just saying, oh, you have African ancestry. You know what I mean? Like, I want to go as far as I can. Oh, well, you come from at least this region, you know, whatever percentage and whatever percentage this region. So I think that's kind of one of the things that I've definitely been a little hesitant about pulling the trigger on, because I want to make sure that I make the right choice and find one that's going to give me at least the most answers that they can give me. The journey thing is definitely something that I think would be worthwhile looking into as well, and attempting to connect on a spiritual level with whatever, you know, is out there, whatever you came from, because I really do think that there is a connection that's more than physical, that's more than what we perceive to be, you know, from a scientific standpoint. I definitely think that there's something that, and even talking from a scientific standpoint, there are things that animals pass on from the parents to their children that we couldn't really explain. I'm not sure we can explain all of them now, you know, like how to fly north for the winter. I think they explain that with like magnetism, but there are different things that seem to be passed on genetically that don't always have like a physical representation, if I'm putting that right. I think you understand what I'm saying here.
Yeah. So there is science behind that now, and it's called epigenetics. So, for example, trauma survivors will pass along their trauma to their children, even though their children didn't experience it. And another way of saying that is intergenerational trauma. And that's a spiritual issue as much as it is a biological one. So it is all related.
I think we definitely see that with terms of racism or just prejudice in general. And it's funny because talking about symbols, I know that there is, even though you might not necessarily have experienced certain things, but because your parents and your grandparents did, there's like a guttural response to certain symbols or certain flags, because historically speaking, these symbols were a sign of danger. So, you know, it's passed on from one generation to the next that this is likely, you know, a situation that you need to stay clear from. And I think that goes really heavily towards what you were saying about generational trauma.
Yeah, I was in the airport in Cologne once, and I got stopped for a security check. And I'd never been in Germany. Well, yeah, I had been in Germany before, but just in the airport. And the guy was pleasant. He was smiling and really, really nice. And when he started speaking to me, all of a sudden I just got panicky. It was something about his eyes and his accent. And, you know, I've seen, you know, World War II things. I've seen Nazi stuff. I'm not a Nazi. I was not a Jew, you know, but I have German heritage. And I think there was something in me that just froze. And I don't know if any of my people were involved in any of that. We were not Jewish, but still there were a lot of other people who were killed by them and were intimidated by them. And there was such a freak out response, and it was just really strange, because I mean, I don't really respond to people like that. And I had to scratch my head and be like, what's going on here? I don't think this is mine, but it is mine because it's, you know, probably in my DNA.
Exactly. Again, it goes back to that guttural response, that guttural reaction. And
yeah.
I think that's something that you can't always control. So you mentioned earlier sovereignty and spirituality, and I think that's definitely something that I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about.
Okay, so when we were thinking about, okay, how are you going to nail this down? And because we didn't want rules, we don't want 10 commandments. That's not what animism is about. You know, what is the nutshell? thing. What can we give people? And sovereignty was the first thing. And to me, sovereignty is everything. Sovereignty is why you have a life. It's for you to explore and to bring your full self into the world so that we can all benefit from you and all you have to offer. And there's this poem, it's my favorite, called by Edmund Waller, called Go Lovely Rose. And it says, and I hope I don't mess it up because I'm going by memory, small is the worth of beauty from the light retired. Bid her forth, suffer herself to be desired, and blush not so to be admired. And that's what I'm talking about. We should all have a chance to shine in whatever way we're blessed to shine. You know, some people are poets, some people are great at fixing things or creating things, some people are funny. We all have something special. And if there's no sovereignty, we don't have the ability to use our own power, we never get to share it with the world. And I think the problem with sovereignty is that some people will do things that other people don't like, you know, or they'll be something that other people don't like. And that's when they get afraid and want to control things. And it's like, you can't be this and be free. You either are free or you're not free.
Right.
You know, it's like you can be free, but you have to do it in my way, which doesn't really work. Either you're sovereign or you're not. And I do think we need rules like don't steal and don't murder so that we can all feel safe. And most of what we argued about, I think, is really not our business or is not important. And so if we embrace sovereignty and live and let live, then racism and hate would just be gone overnight.
Right. So,
yeah.
Do you have any suggestions for developing a spiritual practice, especially for those who might want a non-religious connection?
Yeah, so I think religion is about rules. And when we were setting up as a church, we looked at the IRS rules, and it says that basically says that if you're pagan or your spiritual practice doesn't look like Christianity, then you're not a church. Well, I don't think that your spiritual practice has to look like going to church or having these 10 commandments that we all follow and have no exceptions to and don't change. I think that spirituality is just about how you connect with the all that is. And for a lot of people, that's trees. You know, trees are spectacular. For some, it's the wind. For others, it's a God. So I think that there's something that feels bigger than us that we can lean on and is a good focal point. Touch base with that every day in a way that feels meaningful to you. I think that's a great foundation. Or maybe it's just about making your life a prayer of love. So putting love into everything that you touch and every breath that you take. I think that's the ultimate practice of spirituality. Another thing you can do, and this is probably going to sound really mundane, is just to reach out to your neighbors, to cultivate a community, even if it's just the people to the right and the left of you. When I grew up, you could still roam around the neighborhoods as a kid. And I knew all the elders around me. My sister's best friend's parents were across the streets, and I knew all the kids in the neighborhood. And if somebody got out of line, somebody's mom was going to tell on them. So you really didn't get into a whole lot of trouble because somebody was always looking out for you. And we don't have that today. We have sex trafficking and play dates because people don't know their neighbors. We have loneliness and rampant suicidality because people are so disconnected. So what we can do to cultivate a spiritual practice is to connect with our human communities. People think of spirituality and they think that it's the things that we can't see and the things that we can't explain. But in animism, it's the plant, animal, human, mineral, and spiritual community. So it's everything. So it's whatever that matters to you, whatever that makes your heart go, you know, and warm and juicy inside. I think that's the way that you can do spirituality in an everyday way.
I really like that. That's a great way to put it. You've shared a great amount of information and some very valuable insight. Do you have any caveats on, say, cultural and spiritual appropriation?
Well,
I know that's a loaded question.
I think spirituality belongs. Yeah, I think spirituality belongs to everyone, so I don't think that anybody can own it. But we do have culture, and we do have spiritual practices, and they have been destroyed by colonization and conquest and tourism. And I think we need to be aware of that, because as people move into these places where they're trying to find more connection and more roots and more authenticity, then there's a danger of destroying the thing that they're looking for. I've seen this because I take people on tours all around the world. I've seen this over and over and over. And I think we need to be really, really mindful of what we're taking and what we're leaving. I think we need to be mindful of what is being sold and what's being bought. And maybe there are things that we don't need to buy. Maybe there are things we don't need to have. So, for example, in my culture, they have every household has gods. And they just sit inside the house. They belong to the family. And when the family dies, they pass them down and down. So they could be really, really old. And you don't sell a god ever. But yet I've seen these for sale on eBay. And people are poor in most places where Animist is still indigenous. And they're going to sell their grandmother, maybe, some of them, because they have to eat. And that's a horrible, horrible proposition to be in. What are you going to do? You're going to say no? So people do sell their stuff and people do buy their stuff. And I think that will erode the very thing that you're looking for. I would not look for it there. I'd look for it inside of your heart, because you can't take somebody else's culture and make it your own. That's why we have Pan Society as modern animism. It's today. It's now. We're not throwing away the cell phone. We're not putting on animal skins and living in teepees. We're living this life the way that it is right now in an animist way. So I think I'm not the one to tell people what to do about spiritual and cultural appropriation. I would just say be real mindful of what you want and where you're getting it and what it might be costing somebody.
Eloquently put. Thank you. I really appreciate that. You said that you founded Pan Society. Is there anything that you wanted to share about your organization and your goals for the community going forward?
It's funny because when we first started, our goal was world domination. I tend to go big or go home, and we had really big plans for books and songs and classes, and I don't even know what that would look like, a hippie church, kind of a giant hippie church. I don't know. But we've become much more humble and small-minded, and not in a feeble kind of way. I don't mean small-minded like that, but I'm a half-breed. I'm half modern, half Western, half indigenous, half ancestral. All of these blends of things. And as my animist side gets stronger and my connection gets stronger, the whole idea of the business-minded person that I am, that's getting a lot quieter. And I'm not saying I don't want financial success and I don't want to reach lots of people, but I'm an introvert. I like small, intimate gatherings. I'd much rather have more meaningful relationships with a few people than a big, giant gathering of strangers and a bank account that says you're a success, So to me, it's not really about that. It's really about touching people's hearts and making a difference in their spiritual lives, even if it doesn't show up and you're not making any more money, or you're not more beautiful, or you're not more any of these things that people try to chase and manifest. If your heart is good, if you're at peace, and if you're healing all of this baggage that we all have, then I think that's we're reaching our goal. That's what I want to do.
Thank you so much for that. Do you have any last words or final thoughts you'd like to share with my listeners?
Well, for you, I'd like to give some gratitude for allowing me to be a guest on your show today. So thank you for that. I thank you for creating your podcast. And I'd like to invite all of our listeners here today on this one to check us out, because we're in a lot of places. YouTube, we have a blog, a TikTok channel, Facebook page, and a private Facebook page. And each content has a different slant, so one might work out for you a little bit better. We also have a Patreon page if you want more of a high touch and deeper animist connection. We have a lot of things there, like we have an ancestral clearing group, a book club, online classes. So animism really doesn't have to be about going back to the ancient past or adopting a culture that isn't your own. We're here and we're doing it in a modern way. And so if that appeals to anybody, please check us out.
And if you want to email me those links, I'll make sure I put them in the show notes. so people can find them?
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you so much for sitting down and talking with me. I definitely learned a lot, and I definitely have some things that I need to look more into. And I appreciate all of your words and thoughts that you've shared tonight.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I know that you talked a little bit about your divination practices. So I might end up emailing you in the future to have a discussion about divination one day.
Awesome. Thanks.
Well, I'm going to let you go. I thank you again for coming and talking with me. I don't want to hold you up anymore. And I think that's pretty much it. That was an amazing conversation, and I hope Laura will return for another episode in the future. I've always felt that self discovery and finding a personal connection with one's ancestors and spirituality is a huge part of figuring out who we are and where we are going. There are so many questions out there that beg to be answered, and I feel it's important to never stop searching. Of course, there's nothing wrong with being content with who and where you are now. But if you haven't quite yet found the answers you seek, I hope the discussion tonight has at least helped you a little. I look forward to bringing you another heartfelt episode soon. Until then, Assalamu alaikum and namaste. Peace be with you until we meet again. Thanks for listening to me as I've nerded out about stories and beliefs. Join me next week as I journey down the rabbit hole once again by subscribing and listening wherever podcasts are available. Leave me a comment on iTunes. 5-star reviews are always great and help others find the podcast. Also, you can email me at faithandfearpodcast@gmail.com. And lastly, share with others you feel may enjoy or get something out of these conversations. Who knows? Maybe then we'll be one step closer to glimpsing the true nature of faith and fear. Music courtesy of pixabay.com.